Well, welcome everyone to the 2021 Hayward Lectures. Normally the ADC president opens the annual Hayward Lectures, but as the ADC president is our Hayward lecturer this year, I'm happy to do the job. I'm Danny Zacharias, and one of my roles here at ADC is the director of the Hayward Lectures. We really wanted to be in person this year. Unfortunately, due to the continued issues around COVID, we're once again doing this entirely online, but we're so happy that many of you are already connected with us and following along. So despite being spread out everywhere as we gather online, we are coming to you from Acadia University campus, which is located in the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq peoples, a fact we were reminded of again this past week during the first annual Truth and Reconciliation Day, as well as Treaty Day here in Nova Scotia. It's from this place that we abide, we're nourished by, and our theology is shaped. And part of our rhythm of critical engagement is the Hayward Lectures, established and endowed in 1964 by Mrs. C.C. Hayward of Wolfville. The lectures provide academic dialogue in order to stimulate critical engagement and reflection on key and emerging ideas in church history, Christian theology, and biblical studies. We advance that vision by inviting world-class scholars to Acadia in those disciplines to address the community each October on their freshest ideas, their emerging ideas, their disruptive ideas in the formats of lecture, conversation, and writing. For this year, the invitation for a world-class scholar did not need to go any further than me walking down the stairs to deliver the invitation. So I'm honored to introduce Anna Robbins as our 2021 Hayward Lecturer. Anna has been shaped by the many relationships, roles, and responsibilities that have formed her. Anna is a leader committed to serving the mission with faithful integrity that applies the gospel to real-life issues and relationships with justice, innovation, academic rigor, and joyful expectation. She came to faith at a young age in St. John, New Brunswick, and is a graduate of Carleton University, Acadia University twice over, and she earned her title of doctor by attaining her PhD in 2001 from the University of Wales. She served several churches and as an ordained minister in our convention here, and so she's also a reverend. She served 12 years as a teacher and academic leader at the London School of Theology before returning to her homeland to Nova Scotia with her husband Peter and son David in 2012. If you've ever been on a Zoom call with Anna, you know that her husband and her son are never far from her mind, as a painting of them sits directly behind her in the office, and it often feels like they're present at the meeting as well. She served ADC as the academic dean from 2012 to 2016, the director of the doctoral studies program from 2012 to 2018. She was the vice president and the first director of the Andrew McRae Center from 2016 to the present. Since 2019, in July, she served as president of ADC and dean of theology at Acadia University. She sits also in the Dr. Miller R. Cherry Chair of Theology, Ethics, and Culture, serves on the board of directors for ATS, the Association of Theological Schools. If we were all together, I know you'd join me shortly in applauding for Anna, but one more housekeeping item before we turn it over to her. The Haywards are about intellectual stimulation and engagement. We really do want to hear from you. It's even more important as we're all spread out because we need you to actively engage where you are. Your thoughts and questions will stimulate our collective thoughts and questions. Anna, I know, wants to hear from you. She wants to hear what her lectures stimulate in your mind and in your hearts. So we encourage you to interact with us and each other night as we go through these lectures. The best way that you can do this is if you're watching from the event page on the Acadia Div website. Right next to it is a little chat box, and people have already been saying hello there. If you haven't yet, I encourage you to do so. And as you have questions and thoughts, please add them there. Let's make this a collective conversation around these lectures. You can also use Twitter, and you can use the hashtag Hayward2021. If you happen to be watching on Facebook, if it's actually up now, or on YouTube, you can also chat there, but do know that we're not really attending to those, so you won't see me or Acadia Div people interacting there necessarily, and we certainly won't be able to see your questions there. So if you have a question, we really encourage you to go to that event page and post your questions there. With all of that said, let me just take a moment to open us up in prayer, and then we'll turn it over to Anna. Creator God, thank you that you've created us with creative and wondering minds, that you've given people to us as a community like Anna, who stimulates our thinking, who helps us to think through difficult things, who challenges us in different ways. We're reminded that you call us to renew our minds. And as we come to this topic over the next 3 nights, pray that you would be with Anna. Pray that the technology would go well. And pray that we would have a good conversation as fellow believers in Jesus as we think through these issues together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thanks so much, Danny. Thanks to you and to the faculty for the invitation to present these lectures. I think the only reason anyone could agree to do such a thing in the company of their colleagues is if they know they have the warm support and encouragement of those colleagues. And that warm encouragement is also knit through with great intellect and a sense of fun together. And so I know that I'm not going to get away with anything either, even though I feel very much supported and encouraged in presenting these lectures. I'm grateful to Mrs. Hayward for having that vision and for the opportunity that this has given me to dig into an issue deeply when I'm so often caught up in administration and scholarship can be put aside, or at least on the bottom of the heap sometimes. So to have the motivation to dig into something a lot more deeply and to think through it has been a great gift to me. So thank you for the opportunity. Well, remember when? Some of you are old enough to remember when Paul Simon's song Kodachrome was on the radio. If that's you, then shout out in the chat. Kodachrome was on the radio. Does it make you feel nostalgic when you think of it? If so, well, that's ironic because the song itself is all about nostalgia and the ways that reality just can't measure up to the power of imagination. Simon doesn't want to let the illusion go. So if you brought all the good things together at once, they would pale to black and white, and the rich colors of memory would be lost. Reality will never match the beauty of memory. Kodachrome. They give us those nice bright colors, give us the greens of summers, make you think all the world's a sunny day. Oh yeah, I got a Nikon camera. I'd love to take a photograph, so Mama, don't take my Kodachrome away. Don't destroy the illusions of my memory because they are better than reality. This topic of nostalgia has been percolating for me for some time. I will have former students who will remember the day I hit upon it as the third cultural malaise I identified as I played with some of McGill philosopher Charles Taylor's ideas from a secular age. Others will remember me speaking about nostalgia as a sign of contemporary cultural malaise in conferences and workshops, and a very few will recall me writing about it in a governance magazine for seminaries. Given the opportunity to present this year's Hayward Lectures, I couldn't help but turn to this topic to develop it more fully. Typically, I come to the topic of nostalgia through a cultural lens in the first instance. As a student of contemporary culture, I couldn't help but notice that everywhere we were being told that things were better before. From Netflix series for young people like 13 Reasons Why, to films like Bumblebee and series like Mad Men, nostalgia seemed to be everywhere. In my reflections, I tended to tie it to a nihilistic frame, as expressed in the Peggy Lee axis highlighted by Charles Taylor, and expressed in the 60s song, Is That All There Is? It seemed to me that all this looking backwards was problematic for our culture if we hoped to have a future at all. Moreover, it seemed to rob an emerging generation of the moral resources they would need to engage the world as it is, and to take the lead in addressing some of its biggest problems. In other words, it's not only a cultural phenomenon, but perhaps a problematic one, and ultimately an ethical problem. As I turned to study nostalgia more deeply, I was surprised to discover it treated rather sporadically in theology, while emerging as a field of cross-disciplinary study in its own right. In the past 2 decades, nostalgia studies have truly emerged as a cross-discipline worthy of attention. The disciplines of philosophy and medical psychology, literature, and art seem to be dealing with nostalgia for a very long time. But now it's the focus of study for politics, sociology, business, and science. It crosses boundaries and, quote, does not belong to any specific disciplines, tantalizing us with its fundamental ambivalence. The pervasiveness of nostalgia in culture, as we shall see, makes it surprising that there seems to have been comparatively minimal interest in studying nostalgia from a serious theological perspective. Considering the disruptive role nostalgia plays in contemporary culture, the ways it's used to form and inform our collective consciousness, and the actions of individuals and groups, it's beyond time to rectify some of that neglect through a consideration of the Christian ethics of nostalgia. That is, an exploration of some of the ways that nostalgia impacts our actions as Christians and indeed others in the world today and prevents us from fully embracing a responsible role as agents of hope in the midst of despair. And I hope this will offer a consideration of how a theological reframing of nostalgia might help us move through this present age of homelessness. Though nostalgia as a concept is perhaps as old as human existence in time and space, it has existed tangibly as a word since the 1600s, when Swiss doctor Johannes Hofer coined it as a term to describe the experience of soldiers longing for home while away on mission. The word itself is a compound from 2 words of Greek origin and invites many to consider Homer's Odyssey as the great narrative of the nostalgic journey. Nostos, meaning home, constitutes the ideal space of identity and belonging in a past time. Algia means longing or pain. So it is a homesickness, a longing for home, but it's not a satisfied longing. It's a longing that hurts because of the distance of space and time that renders a return impossible. Not only is a return impossible because of time and distance, but it's impossible because it's held up as an ideal in our minds, an ideal that perhaps never existed in just the way we think of it. As Svetlana Boym puts it, nostalgia is a sentiment of loss and displacement, but it is also a romance with one's own fantasy. Nostalgic love can only survive in a long-distance relationship. And we are all selective with the narratives we tell that shape our understanding of ourselves and our lives that often reflects an ideal more than reality. Narrative, of course, is the shape of our lives. Alistair MacIntyre offers perhaps the most convincing account of the narrative nature of our ethics. It's not that we live and then tell the story. Rather, we tell the story, and through that story we live. Our ethics are the product of a community story of shared history, more akin to virtue than duty, though they need not be mutually exclusive. The story told by our community invites us to participate in an ethic that is formed in us by our shared story, as we tell with our lives that which we have been told. This narrative approach to identity may make some nervous by virtue of its inherent subjectivity and its obvious ethical plurality. No one tells a story exactly as it happened. The story is conditioned by our experience, our perspective, our expectation. What we tell is true, but it may not always be real. And do we not wish to say something of universal relevance, taking the risk of power? For if our story isn't in some sense true beyond the boundaries of our community, why should our ethic be anything more than accident? Jean-Paul Sartre describes the way that narrative is both necessary and false in his classic Nausea, where the biographer Antoine notes that, quote, "Man is always a teller of tales. He lives surrounded by his stories and the stories of others. He sees everything that happens to him through them, and he tries to live his own life as if he were telling a story." For Sartre, telling the story is nevertheless essential for selfhood, and contemporary storytellers of the self would agree. Yet, contemporary narratives are structured by social media platforms where our lives are not narrated so much as curated for consumption. The worst days are edited out and the best moments are in. Digital photos don't have the same impact on memory that print ones did. Your life then becomes a series of curated moments drawn into a presentation for others to consume on the basis of the nature of the given platform. Nostalgia is commodified. flattened by the suggestions from Facebook about what memory you should have today. It's a telling, but it's not entirely our own narrative, let alone an entirely historical one. There is a danger in the midst. Our human stories may need to be told for reasons of selfhood or community identity, and nostalgia may have some psychological benefit here. But the imaginative and the constructive nature of nostalgia may sometimes conflate the tensions between home and away, then and now, dream and reality, memory and history. These tensions are necessary for understanding who we are and where we belong without any major degree of reflection. Without them, we're vulnerable to the cultural forms of nostalgia that distort our view of ourselves and the world. Here in the East Coast, for example, the idea of home looms large enough to define people by whether they are one of ours or come from away. Yet we have a public reputation for hospitality that at least we convince ourselves is characteristic of maritime culture. Here, the past blurs into the present as change happens in rhythm with the tides and the seasons. We perhaps struggle to delineate which is real, our memory or history, or perhaps both or neither. Here, memory lasts a long time, and we prefer the dreams to reality as Nova Scotians, as we will see tomorrow night. Nostalgia, like any narrative, falsifies reality and paints a picture of what you thought you encountered or wished you had encountered. More than that, it paints a picture of who you were in that situation and time, drawing in elements of both truth and falsehood in the forging of an identity. You may long for that time or place, but more, you long for who you were in it, at least for who you think you were. You can therefore have nostalgia for your own past or for a past that you never actually encountered. I remember being nostalgic for an image of hosting a family around a large farmhouse table at the old homestead. I never lived on a homestead, and my family is small, but I like who I am as the family matriarch in this image. Of course, I'm not cooking or cleaning. It is nevertheless very far from reality in so many ways. Nostalgia for what has never been experienced is described variously as ersatz nostalgia or imagined nostalgia. It's a longing for a time and a place where you wish you were because you imagine who you would be in that time and place, but you were never really there. My son has an Elvis lunchbox. He's a very nostalgic kid. It reminds him of a past that is appealing to him, but of course he never experienced and was over before I was ever born, let alone before he was born. When nostalgia becomes pervasive in culture, you can not only invent past experiences, but also ruin your present experiences by engaging in anticipatory nostalgia. Because nostalgia is a longing with pain, it's often characterized by sadness. So you can be sad because the past is gone, and you can be sad because the present will soon be gone, and you will be nostalgic for it. Nostalgia becomes a spiral of longing from which we may never emerge. Perhaps Sartre, the philosopher here, becomes prophet. In this culture, then, we baptize everything in nostalgia. Any object, any event can be converted from an object of history or experience to an object of nostalgia. We don't even need a long time to pass before it's upheld as significant, simply because we can share in the summons, remember when? Museums emerged in the post-World War II era less as historical warehouses and more as display cases for nostalgia and nostalgic presentation. Just a very few years ago, I was visiting the Royal Ontario Museum with my son David. We were enjoying an exhibit on the history of photography when we came upon a display of cameras, extending back well into the 1800s. But to my dismay, also included in the display were the instant cameras of my childhood, including the ones both my mother and myself owned. I was at once overwhelmed by nostalgia, but perhaps more by the dismay that something I remember should be part of a museum display. However, imagine the nostalgic rendering that makes the past ever present. Here is a picture posted on Facebook recently by someone I don't even know, but I saw it there. It was posted in July of this year. And it was taken from the Wolfville Randall House Museum. And they have what he described as a Guinness World Book of Records first, a display case of historic artifacts representing the current pandemic experience, even before it's over. To be fair, the display is in fact an attempt to honor frontline workers and their stories during the pandemic. However, there's still no doubt that it reflects the contemporary act of curating shared cultural objects and experiences to define identity and a sense of belonging. It acknowledges that today is significant, yet in doing so, it renders even unfolding events as nostalgia. Remember the sourdough starter, the fight to find yeast, the first mask you wore? We anticipate nostalgia as our lives are still being lived, and we feel wistful for it. The way our current culture is formed by media imagery encourages anticipatory nostalgia because we document every moment of our lives forging an ideal narrative. We long for that narrative and who we are in it, but like other stories we tell of the past, it's fraught with selectivism and solipsism. In our lives, we become constructors and curators of past identity rather than expressions of a present identity. The photographs we produce for social media with just the right angle, just the right sunset, we tell mostly good stories because we know on our timelines we're creating the anticipatory story of who we were rather than living as we are. We look back and we believe it, every pixel. Rather than live in the present reality, we spend time constructing a nostalgic journey for ourselves. Nostalgic memory means we come to remember even negative events through a wistful longing. My parents-in-law were youngsters in World War II, fighting Hitler for king and country. As an officer in the Canadian Army, my father-in-law saw terrible things in the Italian campaign and in the move north to liberate Holland. But there's no question he looked back nostalgically at the war, by necessity allowing time to filter out the horrors and highlight the friendships and adventures. It wasn't the battlefield he longed for, of course, but who he was as a young, invincible soldier with a righteous cause and men at his command. It was the camaraderie, the shared devotion, along with the clarity about the rightness of their fight. Some research has also been done in the South African context, exploring nostalgia and apartheid, a phenomenon that has attracted both revulsion and empathy. Like the liberated Israelites who longed for the conditions of their slavery in Egypt, it's an almost universal human tendency to long for the past, regardless of what the conditions were. Boehm suggests this nostalgia does not extend to refugees and immigrants in the same way, though, who may not have the same luxury of nostalgia. When one is violently displaced and looking simply to survive in the present, often surviving a horrifying journey to seek freedom, the longing of what came before is postponed until a more settled situation allows for nostalgia and grief of what was lost. When our Atlantic Canadian churches received many Syrian refugees over recent years, I know there were some who were surprised to hear that although deeply grateful for the support they received, some, if not many, refugees longed to return home. It was, after all, their home, a time and a place where they belonged in a way they do not now. Nostalgia, then, is about identity and belonging. It's related to space and time and home. When first diagnosed by Hofer, it seemed prevalent amongst young Europeans, those young Swiss soldiers far from home, triggered by sounds, tastes, and songs of the fatherland. Experienced by Swiss, French, and Russians who threatened to bury nostalgic soldiers alive, it has since been defined in many ways as a European disease. But longing for home exists in every culture, where a strong identity is fostered and shared. It was thought that nostalgia didn't affect American troops, for example, until the young nation developed, and then it did, particularly amongst those rural folks who had experienced less mobility in their lives and whose ties to family and community were strong. The British were thought immune, perhaps because they were not regarded as a sentimental or emotional people. Indeed, such dispensable indulgences as attachment to home and family would have been long ago dealt with at the boarding schools attended by officers sent abroad. The Welsh could not be included in this emotional deficit, however. As Celts, they understood nostalgia as hiraeth, a feeling I can understand even now when I think of the green hills and rainbow-filled valleys of my doctoral days. But let's remember that even the English, cold-hearted though they may be portrayed, long for the land of Jerusalem. not a city of biblical times, nor even one that sits on a Middle Eastern hill today, but as the green hills of England where Jesus himself walked, now blighted by those dark satanic mills. Nostalgic for a past that never was, the call to action comes. But now, catch up your golden arms and chariots of fire, and work to build Jerusalem here in green and pleasant land. The song strangely looks past at something that never happened, as inspiration to build something new for the future, which itself will perhaps never come. And of course, nobody truly believes it will, but it stirs up all kinds of nostalgia. We can see already that a number of types of nostalgia emerge. There's a nostalgia that is a longing for a concrete home in a space and time. This is the German Heimweh, a desire to return, a cyclical chronos reflected in Homer's Odysseus. There's nostalgia that longs for an ideal past, something of individual and collective imagining. This may be understood as Sehnsucht, described by Barbara Casson as, quote, an open nostalgia that never returns to itself, the indefinite infinite of the linear aeon, a non-identifiable, non-mathematizable infinite that flows but never stops. This desire then pursues an indeterminate object or an unfindable ideal. This is related to the nostalgia that longs for something beyond space and time, that brings us to the unfindable and omnipresent objet the cause of desire. This Sehnsucht is described by C.S. Lewis as joy and echoes Heidegger's sense of homeland and indeed the point of all philosophy, to be at home everywhere and nowhere. Influenced by the psychological concepts related to nostalgia unpacked by Sigmund Freud, C.S. Lewis called Sehnsucht the inconsolable longing in the human heart for we know not what. An emotion rather than an idea for him, Sehnsucht is a longing for that unnameable something, a desire for which pierces us like a rapier at the smell of bonfire, the sound of wild ducks flying overhead, the title of the well at the world's end, the opening lines of Kubla Khan, the morning cobwebs in late summer, or the noise of falling waves, as Lewis would put it. For Lewis, Sehnsucht is, quote, an unsatisfied desire, which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. I call it joy, which is here a technical term, to be sharply distinguished both from happiness and from pleasure. Joy, in my sense, has indeed one characteristic and one only in common with them, the fact that anyone who has experienced it will want it again. This drive, Lewis believes, is so natural that we have to learn to ignore it or trample it down if we refuse to engage it. Quote, thinking that if only he tried another woman or went for a more expensive holiday or whatever it is then, this time he really would catch the mysterious something we are after. Most of the bored, discontented, rich people in the world are of this type. They spend their whole lives trotting from woman to woman, from continent to continent, from hobby to hobby, always thinking that the latest is the real thing at last, and always disappointed, end quote. Nostalgia for Lewis is essentially an apologetic for the existence of God. Undefinable desire or longing becomes for him a form of the apologetic argument from beauty, an apologetic that Peter Kraft thinks is the single most intriguing argument in the history of human thought. It is essentially the idea that humans would not have been created with a longing that could not be fulfilled. If we long for the infinite, then it must be possible to find fulfillment in our longing of God. Influenced in the use of these categories by Freud, Lewis's take on nostalgia is personal, individual, may be positively or negatively directed. It's inherent in the soul, a reflection of Lewis's natural theology. Here are echoes of St. Augustine. Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in thee. So this becomes one way of understanding the nature of nostalgia as an aspect of God's image in the created being expressed as a longing for the infinite. But perhaps in cultural form, it is much more complicated than that. As Barbara Casson describes it, nostalgia is, quote, full of ruses, polytropic with 1,000 tricks up its sleeve. This is certainly true of the cultural nostalgias of this moment in time, consumer nostalgia and restorationist, to name but two, that we'll be focusing on tomorrow night. Cultural nostalgias are possibly only in the late modern age, and we are particularly vulnerable to them in moments of significant upheaval and change. Nostalgia operates in contemporary culture to distract and control. Business and politics draw on the longing inherent in human beings and seek to direct it to specific ends for profit and for power. The distraction provided by these cultural nostalgias entices human beings away from engaging a fully ethical life in the present, as we long for home with the pain of knowing this cultural moment is not it. In fact, we fear that this cultural moment suggests no form of homecoming may ever be possible. This is life in dystopia. We can see that nostalgia plays essentially on identity and displacement, disorientation in space and time. We are particularly prone to nostalgia in times of cultural change and instability. In such times, we lose a sense of our bearings and long for the security of home, any time in the past, whether real or imagined. This is understandable in post-war situations or even in the aftermath of a broken home. But living in what Steven Pinker would argue is the most stable period in human history, why are we so given to nostalgia? What is the displacement we feel? Well, first of all, I must clarify we. The culture we in this discussion is the dominant group in culture, predominantly white, historically colonial, nominally Christian. The world in which we find ourselves is one of rapid change, where multiple voices are beginning to be heard and previously guaranteed privileges are questioned, if not actually displaced. This creates an image of the future as unknown, against a past of confidence and certitude. The unknown future must be bad if we don't recognize it, and the failure of institutions like the church assures us of the coming apocalypse. Culturally, foundationalism has gone on its way, and the sea of possible futures emerges and looms as ever real, yet ever threatening. As modernity fragments and ferments, rather than heading to utopia, a la Thomas More, we find ourselves terrified of what is coming. We turn backwards into what sociologist Zygmunt Bauman describes as retrotopia to find security. But what we face at the moment is not simply a turning back, but a disoriented time and space, or rather a dystopia. Dystopia is an imagined state or society in which there's great suffering or injustice, typically one that is totalitarian or post-apocalyptic. You may have seen some dystopian movies that present that sort of landscape. Its use as a word emerged in the 18th century, usually accredited to John Stuart Mill, who was responding to More's Utopia. But it was found much earlier by two other scholars. Patricia Coster found a 1782 use of the word in the work of Noel Turner, but that was surpassed by Budakov's discovery as early as 1747 in a poem admiring the Earl of Chesterfield and his imposition of order upon the dystopia of Ireland. In dystopia, one seeks a good place, a utopia. That's an EU-topia. But it is ever out of reach. More's utopia, was itself, after all, a play on the words for a good place and no place. Dystopia is the place where terrible things have happened or are happening, and freedom is ever under threat, leaving the possibility of an ethical life in fragments. Thriving is traded for surviving, and in survival mode, whether real or imagined, it's every person for themselves. While not strictly inhabiting a totalitarian context, nor a post-apocalyptic one, there are nonetheless cultural traits characteristic of dystopia that form and hinder our current cultural imagination. The all-pervasive presence on the internet and the recognition of our subjectivity to the control of a few through its tentacles that reach into every home and every pocket, the sense that perhaps it's too late to save the world from environmental destruction we've visited upon it, the presence of a global pandemic that's shaken our confidence in human ability to tackle every issue and to continue the road to progress, these have all provided a dystopia, an imagined state or a society where there is great suffering or injustice or likely to be. Rather than be empowered to take action, we hide and pretend it isn't happening, or we shore up our resources to make sure we're among the last to suffer, or we can simply deny that it's happening at all. It was the heyday of Blair's Cool Britannia, the Spice Girls and pro-European spirit. Imagine that long ago. when on a BBC radio panel known as The Moral Maze, that Melanie Phillips of the Daily Mail ridiculed me for positing an imminent future dystopia where we would know neither what was true nor false and would have no way of distinguishing between the two. I still wear that as a badge of honor. Barely 20 years later, hardly anyone except the most stubborn, and perhaps especially a reader of the Daily Mail, would bat an eyelid that we are living firmly in a cultural dystopia. Oddly enough, Phillips released the book 6 months after our conversation entitled The World Turned Upside Down, though I am certain our discussion had no impact on that outcome. Dystopia, though, is both post-apocalyptic and totalitarian, as we shall see. Dystopia feels like a bad place. Ours is a dystopia of environmental destruction, algorithmic control. There's the totalitarianism. Global pandemic, fear, and hostility. Our happiness in the past may have been built on an illusion, but at least we were happy. So the story is told. In dystopia, everything was better before. There is little to hope for and nothing to believe in. The narratives of the past that give us meaning have been torn asunder, and we really don't know who we are anymore. There are futures too terrible to contemplate, and we face them from a position of worry, not confident at all that we will manage to act in ways to prevent the worst from happening. In fact, we are for the most part quite confident that we will not. When climate disaster looms, bringing with it global migration, failed crops, fires, and flood, and not only to the poor, though they will surely bear the brunt of it, polarized politics inhibit even the most hopeful to think that we can harness the best of humanity to tackle such matters. We get a glimpse of the horror of dystopian history in Walter Benjamin's interpretation of Klee's Angelus Novus, which he interprets as the angel of history. Created in 1920 and held by Benjamin for a time, it now hangs in the Museum of Israel in Jerusalem. There it is said that Benjamin felt a mystical identification with the Angelus Novus and incorporated it in his theory of the angel of history, a melancholy view of historical process as an unceasing cycle of despair. Disaster upon disaster piles up behind us, driving us ever forward into what we call progress. Remember, think of the 1920s and 30s as war was unfolding. Benjamin describes an angel, looking as though he's about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history, he writes. His face is turned towards the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed, but a storm is blowing from paradise. It's got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. Benjamin's words manage to capture in this description the inability of the past of human history to provide moral guidance for the future. Yet, sociologist Zygmunt Bauman's response here is insightful, helping us to grasp more fully the dystopia of the present age. He writes this: were one to look closely at Klee's drawing, almost a century after Benjamin put on record his unfathomably profound and indeed incomparable insight, one would catch the angel of history once more in full flight. What might, however, strike the viewer most is the angel changing direction. The angel of history caught in the midst of a U-turn, his face turning from the past to the future, his wings being pushed backwards by the storm blowing this time from the imagined, anticipated, and feared in advance hell of the future towards the paradise of the past, as probably it is retrospectively imagined after it has been lost and fallen into ruins, though the wings are pressed now as they were pressed then, with such a mighty violence that the angel can no longer close them. Here, the future appears as hell, pushing us backwards into the paradise of the past. Cultural dystopia, then, gives momentum to a culture of nostalgia. It's where we turn for comfort out of fear of what is to come. In this global epidemic of nostalgia, as it is often called, we have an effective yearning for a community with a collective memory or a longing for continuity in a fragmented world. Nostalgia inevitably reappears as a defense mechanism in a time of accelerated rhythms of life and historic upheavals, as Boehm would say. What is needed is a moral witness, a people in a church who are unafraid to see and to speak and to act. A retreat into nostalgia will prevent the church from fulfilling that call. For the church, there has been not only an imagined, but a real cultural displacement, together with the structure to facilitate collective longing and memory. The present displacement is not to be imagined as an exile, so much as an exodus to the wilderness for a church that had so closely hitched its wagon to the horses of the modern state and its benefits. Unable to imagine a future untethered from the protection of the state, churches experience the full, disorienting effects of life in dystopia. Life after Christendom sends the church into a dystopic culture feeling uprooted and homeless. The rate of change through disembedding from culture and the experience of decline makes the church or the future too fearful and uncertain to contemplate. So, like others, the church looks backwards for its security. The church seeks to remake the present and even the future in the image of the past. Indeed, if the church is to live in dystopia, it will require forms we may never have tried or experienced before. Such forms and their accompanying actions are inhibited by nostalgic reverie. I return to the idea again of we. The cultural displacement many of us have felt comes as an overwhelming glimpse of change for others. As our present status in society is challenged, both as the church and as the largely white church, we feel all the more at sea. It is perhaps worse for leaders who emerge from a pandemic world weary and wondering, do I even know who I am in this new world? Do I even know how to serve my people anymore? Yet for others, it may bring with it a welcome, if equally painful, change of tide. If you've been feeling disoriented and fearful, perhaps now you know why. Following Boehm's dual typology, we have options for how we respond to nostalgic life in dystopia. We can reflect critically on our nostalgic tendencies and dreams, engaging them in ways that inspire yet seek some measure of truth-telling that might contribute to a role as a moral witness in history. Or we can look to restore our past identity in the present. Nostalgia then becomes a collective power play that expresses itself in nationalism or even ecclesiocracy. The East Coast Church is a particularly nostalgic church. Because of deep roots of identity in times and places, we often find ourselves with an inability to imagine the community outside of the building, along with its brass plaques and plates, an inability to relinquish control to people we neither know nor understand, whether newcomers or young people, a fondness for anniversaries replete with costumes and a decor that never changes. No matter how many times you've updated the interior of your home, often the interior of our churches is regarded as unchangeable. We want it to look exactly how it looked when we were baptized/married/buried. These physical manifestations of nostalgia mask the worst spiritual ones, where we'd rather die in the past than live in life in the company of the Spirit. Here, we not only replicate the sins of the past while avoiding the challenges of the future, but we whitewash them in nostalgic innocence that prevents our full functioning as moral agents. What I hope is becoming apparent as we near the end of this paper tonight is that the ways we remember the past have consequences for our behavior in the present and the ways we regard the future. The explosion of memory studies along with nostalgia would bear witness to this reality. Remembering selectively, as nostalgia causes us to do, emerges from moral motives and bears ethical consequences. Nostalgia, for example, with its idealistic conjuring of the past, has been referred to as history without guilt. We consign our ethical failures to the abyss of forgetting, along with those people who somehow don't fit into our nostalgic stories. The subjectivity and selectivity of nostalgia as a narrative form renders it inherently solipsistic and potentially controlling of the vision of the future. Uncritical nostalgia repeats again and again the injustices of the past without ever breaking free of old patterns. Dystopic cultural conditions lead us to seek security within ourselves, either in escapism or in bids for power. If our churches, and indeed the faith itself, are to survive their cultural displacement, they will need to find a new way of acting in the world, informed by more than their own reassuring memory narrative known as nostalgia. Nostalgia is a cultural reality that, because of a strong sense of place and time amongst a people intimately tied to family and land, has particular sway in distracting the ethical life of Christians and churches. However, the more inhibited we are as moral agents in our communities, the less inhabited we are in our identity as ambassadors of reconciliation, and the more irrelevant and displaced we become in our culture. A Kodachrome church may look pretty, but it isn't real. Nostalgia too easily masks the incongruities of our history, as we will see tomorrow night. Thanks very much.
All right. We've had a lot to think about, and I have all my stuff open here as I was taking notes and writing down questions, and some are coming in. And if you have questions, I am still looking at the chat here, so please put them in. But I'll start with a few, maybe just clarifications, Anna. And if I look over this way, camera, it's because Anna's over there, and I'm looking at you right here. So just maybe a few clarifications, and I want to say that you may have sparked a good idea. Someone posted that Retrotopia sounds like a really good paint color that may match good carpets and things like that. So I thought that was pretty funny, and I thought you'd like that.
Pink color.
So the first kind of question came in as you were going along was the clarification: is nostalgia always sad?
No. I mean, I hope what came through is that there's a lot of different kinds of nostalgia and how you define nostalgia is important. And there are personal nostalgias and collective ones. I'm really interested in the collective ones and the interplay between the personal and the collective. The longing, for example, if we understand it as C.S. Lewis did, as a longing for God, it is painful, but not necessarily sad. It's I think, again, Lewis puts it very well, because he says it's a longing for you don't exactly know what. And most people that I talk to, I say, have you ever felt that feeling? You know, when you're looking at a sunset, or it's been a particularly, satisfying day, and you sit and there's a longing. It was so good. And it's the sadness is that it's gone, but there's also the happiness that it was good. So I would say not always sad, but there's always a pain of some kind in it. That's the whole definition of the word. There's a pain in it, a pang, even if it's not physically painful. But some people carry the physical pain of loss of home.
Yeah. Okay. I think you gave this line, but a question came in. I think I heard you say while I was typing the question, anticipatory nostalgia. Yeah. So is that, would you say then eschatological hope? Like, would you label that as an anticipatory nostalgia? Christian eschatological hope?
No, I think anticipatory nostalgia is much more looking at the present and knowing that you will one day long for it. So you're anticipating having nostalgia about the present that you're living in, right? So we'll look back tonight, and we'll be really nostalgic about it. And so right now I'm going to talk about this, how I'm going to miss this moment. So you never live it, right? You're always anticipating. So it's not the same as looking to the future directly, if that makes sense.
Okay. So in what ways, like, how do we differentiate in our minds as we think about nostalgia, those things that came about? Like, someone kind of jokingly said, like, if we didn't have nostalgia, Melody Maxwell may be out of a job, because it's remembering things too, right? And certain a lot of the scriptures, if it wasn't bound to things that they needed to remember. So how do we draw that line between nostalgia and just proper remembering?
I'll say a couple of things. One, I don't think all nostalgia is negative. I'm when I talk about cultural nostalgia, I think it is largely negative, not all nostalgia is negative. It's a human condition. It's an is. And it's what we do with it then that is important. So it's the forms of cultural nostalgia that I'm really after. On the third night together, we'll talk about some more positive forms of nostalgia, and I'll actually refer to some in scripture. And tomorrow night, I unpack a lot about the difference between memory and history. And I'll look to Ricoeur to help us with some of that. I don't want to go too much further because I unpack that in detail tomorrow night. I hope that whoever asked that will be patient for that.
I just noticed someone now said it reminds them of the old song "Hurt So Good," which is, I heard of that one. I didn't hear the first one you mentioned. It was John Cougar.
Too young for the
Mellencamp,
Kodachrome.
"Hurt So
Oh,
Good,"
Kodachrome, Danny.
yeah. So how do we gauge then when nostalgia is being helpful versus negative? When is it holding us back or causing us a lack of movement?
Well, again, that tonight I really had to lay out some of the definitions and introductions of nostalgia. I talk a lot more about that again tomorrow. And there are ways to approach that in terms of personal nostalgia again, or in terms of collective nostalgia. In personal nostalgia, I think it's when you're just never, you can't function in the present because you're always anticipating missing what's happening now, and always living in the past. I'll talk far more about what this looks like in a consumer culture, particularly tomorrow night, where that's unhelpful, and then how on the third night how that will look much more positive in light of a scriptural view. So again, I don't want to give away too much of what's coming, and I'm glad that these are the questions, because they're the right questions to ask about what comes next. And I want to do justice to the question, but I also don't want to shortchange you for the subsequent nights. But I think any time that we are prevented from acting well in the present, because we are so stuck in looking backwards, whatever that looks like for us, then that's unhealthy. And nostalgia, for example, as Lewis defined it, as a longing for God, it can be a positive thing, but our longing, as he said, is always, so often we seek to misdirect it. And I think I don't like to tie everything up, but I think I have a good way of addressing this when we come to night 3. At least it makes me happy. I hope it's helpful to whoever asked the question when night 3 comes. And if that question isn't answered by then I haven't done my job.
Thinking back to the American presidential election, do you think that was a fight over nostalgia when Trump was saying,
Absolutely.
making it great again?
It's a completely nostalgic play, right? To claim, let's make America great again, when actually, when did it stop being great? I mean, at what point did that happen? It wasn't that anything had happened. It's that he knew he could play on the power of nostalgia. And marketers do exactly the same thing. This is the power of it, you see, and we will talk about this tomorrow night, but I don't mind saying that marketers know that this is a quality of human existence, this longing that we have, and they bank on it. I mean, they put things out, and I've said this before in other places where I've spoken, they put things out in cycles. So a particular film that has a marketing plan around it with all the toys and the merch that comes with the film, you can guarantee that's on a cycle, right? To try to create the nostalgic longing so that the kids who watch it now in 20 years will take their kids to watch it, and they can milk that whole franchise all over again because of nostalgia. And this happens all the time. It's why it's such a big player in our culture at the moment. And I've heard people say, there are no new ideas anymore. That's not the case. It's just they don't pay, and they can guarantee a return on the investment into something that is nostalgic. And if you look at, say, and I'll mention this tomorrow, the Star Wars enterprise, for example, they've found a way to even circumvent the 10 to 20-year cycle by finding a way to perpetuate the nostalgia in a constant kind of series of television shows and merch that just constantly rolls out. Video games, the same. And there's so many ads. Just watch them. In fact, that'd be a great challenge. I'd love for those who are participating in these lectures between now and tomorrow night, just see how many ads or how many things you encounter that play on your nostalgia. because they know if they can elicit the emotion in you, you will part with your money for that object. And so there are ads all over the place. If we could show these kinds of things in a live setting, I'd show you some of the ways that they subtly even sometimes just play on the feeling of nostalgia. And that pang of longing that you get elicits the kind of emotion that means you will buy a product that you might not have ever wanted otherwise. And they're smart. They're smart. And that's one way that our nostalgia, I think, becomes negative, because we're not aware that that's what's happening. And I think if we're aware of our nostalgia and how it works, then we can better take ownership of it and responsibility for it, rather than be prey to some of these other forces. But I will talk about those both in terms of consumer and some of the political pull in the collective realm tomorrow night, because those are certainly ways that the cultural forms of nostalgia draw that very natural quality in us in very negative directions.
Someone asked, do you think when you see people whipping out their cell phone to record something that they're actually participating in, that's being driven by nostalgia? I remember back a few years ago, I don't know how I was watching because I don't have cable, but it was the Junos, and a whole bunch of musicians came out and joined the final act. And as they were walking, several of them are like, they're supposed to be singing, but they're rushing to get their cell phones out of their pockets so they can record the fact that they're part of it rather than being part of the event.
That's anticipatory nostalgia.
Okay.
Not living in the moment, because you're looking towards the moment in a few moments when it's going to be nostalgia to you. And I think we definitely are in a social media world. That is how we construct our identity. We curate our identity for consumption. And instead of living in any moment, we're thinking about the right angle, the right take on it, so that we're creating for ourselves the narrative of our lives on in Facebook. How ironic that it's down tonight. But that's what we're doing. We're curating our lives so that we can have this nostalgic presentation for others, but also for ourselves. And it's so selective, because it's only the things that you've put up that then become your memory. We know that memory works in a way that things that you're prompted in, you tend to remember far more than the things you're not prompted in. So if you have a picture from when you're a kid and of a particular birthday, you remember that birthday far better than you remember all the other birthdays where there's no pictures, right? You just do. And so the things that we have produced to record the events of our lives, so that we can have a nostalgic look back and tell the story, that curation is a nostalgic curation. There's no question, I think, that that's the case. And and it's because we're looking at what it's like to tell the story of our lives, to narrate our lives, when we know one day we'll be looking back, which is usually tomorrow.
So you talked a little bit about, you mentioned him briefly, but then you kind of expanded on Steven Pinker and his talk about society never being more stable. And of course, that's, like you said, it's relative to who is saying that in some sense. But how do we navigate that if we tend to have that close to utopian outlook, I guess, on society now? How do we mitigate that danger? Isn't in those cases nostalgia perhaps helping us for not thinking too highly of what we're doing in society?
Yeah, I think that it helps us to be perhaps a bit more realistic. Yes, if we just, as long as we don't become overreactionary to it. I have to wonder whether they would say exactly the same thing post-pandemic, because a lot of Pinker's optimism is built on the success around the UN Millennium Goals, which have been pushed so far back through the pandemic that I think people are probably afraid to even dig in and find out how far back they've been pushed. Places are having famine that we never expected to have famine, and the poor of the world are going to bear the brunt of all of the cost of keeping the West as well vaccinated as we've been. So I do wonder if they will still say that. I also think that they were biased in their view in terms of yes, not taking full appreciation of the history that we've lived, and it becomes another means of escape from reality that sometimes nostalgia can either call us to, or nostalgia can itself mask. It depends on the specific stories they're telling. Are they trying to create a nostalgic feeling of why the world is better now than it was before, as opposed to it was better before? I think either one could be a nostalgic telling, as well as nostalgia engaging with it to offer some corrective.
I just saw in the chat, and for everyone, just to mark this moment in nostalgia, they said, why don't you take a selfie with the live stream behind you? Just, it would really hit home on what we're doing
Should
here.
I do that? No.
You can do it after, maybe. Well, there's just a few more questions to go here, but I wonder, someone asked, how can awareness of our longings help us navigate the spiral of longing that you've been describing?
Yeah, again, I will talk more about this as we go on, but I will say that there is a reflective form of nostalgia that allows us to ask questions of ourselves. Like, we don't have to be caught into the spiral of nostalgia. I think we're being drawn very much into one in a dystopic culture, but we don't have to be drawn into it. So I will be talking tomorrow about consumer nostalgia and restorative nostalgia that are really strong pulls in a negative direction. But there is also, Svetlana Boym talks a lot about a critical nostalgia that is able to reflect on our own nostalgia in ways that are really constructive, to say, why am I longing for that thing? Why am I longing for that time? What is it about that time that draws me? Am I accepting the fact that I can't go back? What can I take from that with me? What went wrong about that time? What went right about it? So she believes you can engage your nostalgia reflectively, and engage it therefore critically, so that we don't just have to keep repeating the past over and over again, or get caught into that nostalgic spiral. And I think she's right. You can sit and reflect and say, what was it about that time? Why am I so stuck there? What is it that holds me there? What is my longing for home really all about? And I think sometimes we can even enjoy our longings. Is that fair to say? I think nostalgia is enjoyable. Psychologists say this. Again, I'll mention that tomorrow. But psychologists say that nostalgia is actually really healthy for us, because it elicits good feelings. It can make you, contented in yourself as you think about the past and so on, and your identity and who you are, where you came from. It doesn't have to all be negative at all. But I would say, in light of what the psychologists say, that I would want to be critical about that as well. Like, if we need nostalgia to feel good, what is it about that nostalgia that is making us feel good that maybe we need to engage a little more deeply?
How would there be a difference in what we see in scripture, where they will use figural imagery and pulling it from their past stories, to talk about something in the present or the future? In what way is that different from a healthy or unhealthy nostalgia?
Yeah, I mean, again, it comes to this, what I'll talk a lot about tomorrow, this breakdown between a memory narrative and a history narrative, and between an individual and a collective. And there's no way I'll be able to address all of that, because there's been so much that's been done in memory studies beyond nostalgia studies around the history of Israel, particularly, and how collective memory works for Israel. It's a very specific case, but I think that it's fair to say that there are aspects of history that are distinguishable from memory history. So shall I go into it just a little bit, in case someone won't be here tomorrow, I guess? So Paul Ricoeur talks about the difference between memory narrative and history narrative. So in a world shaped by narratives, we have ones these are our memories, and that's the narrative that we tell about ourselves and our stories. So Israel has this story that Israel tells about itself. And then there's history narratives. That's where you're looking at pulling out the facts and studying what were the actual events that unfolded, much more detached from your participation in it. And those two things need to come into dialogue in order to have a much clearer picture of what happened that is still yet embodied, right? Because if you just simply take it as facts, then It's not an embodied or lived history. So those two things need to be present in interplay. And I think what we see in the history of Israel unfolded in Scripture is that interaction with a history narrative, maybe not always and at every point. And I'll point out one particular scripture that way on Wednesday that I think confuses the two. But most often there is this interplay of memory narrative with history narrative that lends much more integrity to the narrative, that renders it not simply as nostalgic. But there is a lot of nostalgia in the Bible, but it's different from the setting up of a monument, for example, that says, remember, this is how far the Lord helped us. The Lord helped us this far. Remember, that's meant to be a historical remembrance of something that happened, which is different from, well, here's the story we tell where we all know together that we're glossing over some of the facts and so on, but this is the story as we experienced it and how it sits with us now with some of those, slightly falsifying aspects simply because nobody remembers and can tell exactly how something was.
This isn't really a question, but I just thought it was a really good comment, and maybe you wanted to reflect on it. One of our people in the chat said, with counseling, narrative therapy works with a person or a group's negative stories that they tell about themselves being stuck there, and then they find the threads with the stories that bring out resilience, strength, and other positives that can be carried into the future. So it was more a statement than a question.
No, then that's helpful, actually. And that's a great example of a positive way that you can draw on a nostalgia or a nostalgic experience and make it live into the present and the future. That's great. Very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. And as you know, in Nate's, we would call that asset-based, asset-based approaches, finding those things within your stories to pull and build on.
That's right. But it's not saying, but then go back and live in that story, right? It's pulling out the positives. That's great. Thanks.
Yeah. So one person mentioned this, and this will be the last question for the night. Someone said translating these realities is a challenge for church leadership. So in that vein, I have a last question. I wonder, what do you think nostalgia does to the different generations that we have sitting in our churches? Seniors in the middle ages, and then those who are coming up in teens and children.
Yeah. Well, certainly we all have it because it's a human, I believe it's a basic human aspect. Very natural to our being. But it does manifest in different ways. And so, and again, it's really hard to generalize generationally. I'm not one who's keen to generalize across generations very much because, sometimes people say, well, older people are slow to change, but actually your oldest people have witnessed the most change in their lives and sometimes they're the most flexible. And it's sometimes the middle-aged people who have an interest in keeping things the same, out of interests of stability and so on, that are most resistant to change. But nostalgia can function either negatively or helpfully. If you're remembering the past and wanting to live there and bring the church back to that time, that's negative because we cannot go back. We are literally homeless from that time. We are displaced from that time in time and space, and we cannot go back. And so some will long for it and think that we can, and they will work for that. Preserve everything as it is at every cost. And there are some young people who feel that too, to be honest. So I don't want to draw that generationally, but then there are others. And these will be your millennials and younger, I think, in the main, who will be, they will see some of those remembrances as nostalgic in a way that they can't relate to, but they are caught up in their own nostalgia of narrating their lives in a way that they want to look back in a way that they can tell their lives that was exciting or interesting rather than necessarily longing after a closer relationship with God and a walk with God as a community where we're actually encountering the divine and encountering the divine wisdom for the congregation. So that's probably a really long, circuitous, I've been talking too long. It's a long, complicated way of saying that, it's a big question, and I think it will manifest itself in different ways, in different individuals, within different generations, in different churches. I don't think we can generalize that. I really don't. But I think we can help people to understand and engage their nostalgia so that they can then help to identify within your congregation, how is nostalgia working out for us? Is it something that's helping us to be critical and reflective on our past and our present so that we can act well into the future? Or is it something that's drawing us down? Is it a weight that's pulling us down rather than something that's helping to push us towards God? It's maybe pushing us away from God. So I would put it that way probably, rather than generalize across generations and that sort of thing. There are obviously particular things that we can pull out, but I think the bigger question is, how are we using that desire that is in us for home to draw us ever closer to God as a people, regardless of how old we are or where we are.
Maybe just to follow up on that, do you think maybe there's a generation that may be more prone to be damaged by negative nostalgia in a group?
Oh, well, I came to this topic, and I'm not saying they would be more damaged by it, but I came to this topic because I was speaking with young people in different places and just devastated by their actual belief that things were better before, that their world is worse, that their parents' world was better, and that this is the best they can do. And we want better than that for the generation to come. They need to come up and say, oh no, you people, you made a mess of it. We're going to make it right. But instead, what we're telling them is that the world is so broken. It's that angel of history again, being pushed into the past because the future is too horrific. We're telling them that the world is going to burn. That's what we're telling them. The world is going to burn. We've ruined it. It's too late. Good luck surviving. And we've hidden our heads in the sand, saying, yeah, you're right, it was better before, and then seek to recreate all of that in our entertainments and in our the way that we do church, the way that we live our lives, rather than actually saying, look, let's walk together into this future, as terrifying as it is, because you will make a difference. So we've disempowered an entire generation. Sorry, I know I'm preaching now, but that's what brought me to this topic. That's what makes me passionate, is that we have shortchanged an entire generation by convincing them that there's nothing they can do to make an impact on the world positively for Christ. And that is something we have to bear, and I think we have to address.
Well, that's a good word to end on. Thank you, everyone, for engaging in the chat. There was a lot of discussion. I'm sure Anna will be reading through it. You can take the time now if you want to just say thank you, if you haven't yet, in the chat to Anna, since she can't hear your claps or see your smiles. And thanks again, Anna. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. And please come back 7 p.m. tomorrow as we tackle Lecture 2 on nostalgia.